Okay. 3, 2, 1. Well, hold on.
It was a good start, Grant. I'll give you that.
Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a panel discussion, a good one, in fact. What do you mean when you say pub rock? So we will try to get down to it. What do you mean when you say pub rock? Well, we'll find out here in a moment. So without any further ado, let's get started. Contrarians, and tonight we have a topic. Actually, it was suggested by Martin, and the topic tonight is what do you mean when you say pub rock? Now, if you look like on Wikipedia and around, there is a definition of pub rock. It's a subgenre of rock music that emerged in the early 70s in the UK. Now we've got Davy Gallagher from Scotland. He's representing that area. And we've got Peter Kerr from Australia. And then, of course, we have Martin from Canada. And I'm in the U.S., but I really don't have any opinion on pub rock. I'm just here to make sure everything goes okay. So, but it's basically a back to basics movement that incorporated roots rock, from what I understand. It was kind of like the progressive rock and glam rock music thing. It's kind of complicated, but this is why we have these gentlemen here. So I'm going to start off with Davy Gallagher and get his impression on what pub rock is. We're going to keep it loose. We're just going to have a general discussion, and I'll just go around the horn, and we'll just go Davy, Peter, and then Martin follow up with me. And like I said, kids, I don't have much to say about it, but I'm glad to be here anyway. Davy Gallagher, let's start off with you. What do you mean when you say pub rock?
Well, good evening, everybody. But first of all, I don't say pub rock for that simple reason.
There's the first number one. I should write these down.
Yeah, because I don't think it's not, well, it isn't a sound. Anyone who says it's this or it's that, well, it can be this or that. It can be retro, rock and roll, bit of boogie, or it can be jazz, or it can be leading into new wave, or it can be punkish, or it can be a plethora of things. Essentially, it's a scene. It's not a sound at all. So it's acts who came from a specific scene, i.e. the pub scene, literally. And the reason that it's considered a rebellion against glam and prog, well, you try going into a pub in Essex wearing Rick Wakeman's cape, you're not going to be walking out. So it's not because it's a conscious rebellion, it's because that's what you wear to the bloody pub. So it wasn't rebellion in the way that punk was a rebellion. It's, in a lot of ways, it's punk without the anger, but it doesn't have the musical aesthetic of punk either. It's amorphous. It doesn't have one set sound. Some of the staples of the movement, I mean, Brinsley Schwartz, kind of one of the more prominent to kick it off. But they start with a very Robbie Robertson-inspired country rock, really good time stuff. And then who comes out of that band? Nick Lowe. And then he goes on to work with The Damned, Elvis Costello, a million other people, ends up married to Johnny Cash's daughter. And his stuff is nothing like early, it's nothing like his own stuff 10 years earlier. Once we move into the new wave, even his classic soul album Jesus is Cool doesn't sound like Brinsley Schwartz, but it is a kind of cool release though, that he is kind of the godfather of the whole scene, and there he is, very messianic, literally on the cross. That's rather wonderful. Nick Lowe's probably considered to be one of the real godfathers of the scene, but again, I think it is a scene, not a sound. So if you come at it from that point of view, then yes, Nick Lowe is, but so is somebody who doesn't have any connection to that kind of sound for me, which would be Graham Parker. So Graham Parker's sound, Graham Parker and the Rumour, I should say, because what a terrific band. I mean, the Up Escalate, one of the great albums. Like, all these albums are so good, though. He doesn't do bad albums, but these early ones are particularly good. These things, if you played them for, especially something like the Up Escalator, for a Springsteen fan, and said it was an American act from around the same time, they wouldn't think this was English music. Not at all. They wouldn't think, oh, that's pub rock, that's a bit knees up, Mother Brown, a bit of Cockney at the piano. Nothing like that at all. Nothing at all. So again, this is nothing like that, which is nothing like this. So it's a very amorphous scene. And then other acts that are so associated with it, Eddie and the Hot Rods, right? I love Eddie and the Hot Rods. I think they're one of the cool bands, the really coolest bands to come out of the scene. And they've got a wonderfully punk aesthetic, musically sometimes, on like Teenage Depression, you know, literally showing suicide on that. And then so does the second album. You know, so they've got this darkness to them. But when you see them perform, they are exactly what you'd imagine a pub band would look like. Status quo roadies. Everybody's in denim, bit of chest hair sticking out of a dirty looking shirt. Nobody's good looking. Everybody's rough and ready. So it's very much an anti-aesthetic scene as well. It's not what do you look like? What do you need to fit into pub rock? Do you need the right makeup? Do you need the right blah blah blah? Because as much as punk will pretend that it's, oh, we're anti-glam and we're anti this, punk has its own rules and regulations. You have to have the right hair, you have to have the right ripped denims, you have to have the right leather, blah blah blah. So this is a much more straight ahead scene than that. And you start to get members of bands like Eddie and the Hot Rods, and especially the Motors, another great band, who start moving around. So a member here will go into, in fact, Brinsley Schwartz going into, a couple of members going into Graham Parker and the Rumour, and not as a collaboration, just as band members. So it's a very kind of incestuous scene in that regards as well, where it's everybody knows everybody. Nick Lowe seems to know everybody and connect everybody. Elvis Costello is in and about, but you won't really hear him called pub rock. Even though a lot of the music of the scene is very Costello-esque, and a lot of his music is very similar to what we would consider to be pub rock. And then you get like Bram Tchaikovsky from the Motors, wonderful stuff in his own separate. It's a scene that encapsulates a lot of different types of music, but it's not one. So as I said, it starts with country rock, I'd say, kickstarts it, and rock and roll, with a lot more rock and roll thrown in there, because you have a massive event, Wembley 72, the big rock and roll revival concert, where Wembley Stadium is sold out by Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and all of a sudden, all these rock and roll guys come to London and they almost always called them the London album. Muddy Waters did one, Jerry Lee Lewis did one. And the guys who were 19, 20, 21 going to that show kind of learn from that, go out and start bringing rock and roll back. Quite similarly to the way punk would do a few years later, but again without the aggression. It's almost like without the testosterone added. These guys would be playing darts after a gig rather than throwing glasses. So it's different in regards to the anger and the energy. There's no fury. There's no righteous indignation. There can be some more protesty things, because again, these scenes do kind of drift into each other. So you get somebody like, let's see, Reckless Eric, who, yes, he's very pub rock in a lot of places, but he's also very punk rock. He's very singer-songwriter. He's very protests. He's very folk. He's very bluesy. So again, you wouldn't pub rock doesn't define that sound. It's where they start, it's where they group, it's where they congregate, but it's not the actual sound itself. So Reckless Eric is nothing like Brinsley Schwartz, even though you look them up, you'll see them both listed as pub rock, but it's nothing to connect them at all. There's musical DNA, but c'est la vie. Everybody's got the same musical DNA. You know, how many people quote the same Beatles, Elvis, you know, kind of trifecta of acts from the early days. And then you get Ian Dury and the Blockheads, who again start to drift much more into punk. You'll start to see them listed a lot more as punk acts, unless you're talking about the very, very early stuff, where I've seen some people describe him as novelty acts. You would never get that in the UK, because he was never considered a novelty. He was considered as legit an artist as anybody else. His lyrics are playful and old school, almost Gilbert and Sullivan style, a real classic wordsmith. And then somebody who's not that at all is, where are we going? Let's see, Frankie Miller. Frankie Miller doesn't have that classic English singer-songwriter thing, because he's just a blues hauler or soul singer from Glasgow. But he's a great vocalist. And on one of his records, who's the backing band for the whole record? Brinsley Schwartz. So it's all kind of feeding into each other. And everybody would splinter off late 70s into the 80s into a million different directions. But generally speaking, that's my thesis on it. When somebody says, what is pub rock? I say, it isn't pub rock to start with. There's rock that was played in pubs, but it doesn't make it pub rock. So there's about 5 to 10 different places you could start any one person on their journey to pub rock, depending on who they are. So I'll leave it there and let the other guys go.
Well, Davey, that's
Nice.
the way you left that's great, but let's
Excellent
say I
start,
want to
Nick.
get into pub rock. Like me, I don't know much about it. Yeah, I know Brinsley Schwartz kind of was the start, but where would I want to go and start?
So with you, for example, Grant, that very much my point. I wouldn't just say look up the top pub rock artists, because it's a fallacy to do so. I don't think you'd get on with Brinsley Schwartz in a lot of places. I think you'd find it fine, but I don't think you'd find it particularly fascinating. Whereas whatever I've put him, Graham Parker, I think you'd absolutely love. Because you're a big Elvis Costello fan. I think you'd find a lot of common ground there. Towards a lot of the more serious Elvis Costello stuff. And he's just a wonderful songwriter. He never steps too far in one direction in terms of going towards punk or new wave. Or his albums are pretty timeless, especially around this period. And like everybody, the first couple are usually a bit more of their time, so like 76, 77, that kind of period. And that's, again, what differentiates Brinsley Schwartz. They started in 1970, so they're a lot ahead of the curves.
Yeah.
And you get bands like Ducks Deluxe. So if you were much more of a, say, an Elvis fan, or better, Gene Vincent fan, I'd say. If you were more of a Eddie Cochran fan, I'd start you there.
Okay.
But I wouldn't start you with Brinsley Schwartz, for example. So, yeah, so it's not just a case up the top 5 and then just try them, because I think you need to take into account the listener rather than just you and what you want to spread.
Sweet.
Very well. Good. Super. All right, Peter Kerr. What do you mean when you say pub rock in Australia?
Well, like Davy, it's kind of a scene, and it was a scene that was prevalent in the 70s and 80s. But look, the Australian pub is the epicenter of culture. I mean, we're a nation of convicts. The early currency of Australia was rum, and the pub has always been the social hotspot of every major city in Australia. In the 60s, everything was very polite and old school. You had the pubs, but in respect of the music scene in Australia, there were concerts. The pub scene had not sort of been the epicenter of music. So you had artists like Johnny O'Keefe, who was like a protege, similar to Elvis Presley, was our answer to Elvis Presley. You had the Easy Beats, which was our answer to the Beatles. And later in the 60s, you had the Masters Apprentices, who were the kind of the answer to the Rolling Stones. Check out those bands, they're all great. In the 70s, things started to change and evolve, and the pub became more of a scene for up-and-coming acts. And it wasn't really, I mean, can you define the sound? Well, the sound of Aussie pub rock was anything that was basically electrified. Heavy rock, blues rock, progressive rock, folk rock. And then when you get into the later 70s and the early 80s, you've got punk, you've got indie, you've got bands like Radio Birdman, which were, doing the garage rock, Detroit rock sound, new wave. It's a potpourri of all different social influences. So pub rock, I can pinpoint it to a couple of artists. Billy Thorpe. So Billy Thorpe was probably known in America in the 70s or the late 70s when he went over there, had a few minor hits. Billy Thorpe fronted some sort of beat bands, but in the early 70s, he fronted a band called the Aztecs, Billy Thorpe and the Aztecs, and they were kind of stoner rock, progressive, heavy rock. And he really kick-started his career with a festival called the Sunbury Music Festival, which was like our version of Woodstock. In Australia, everything is like 3 or 4 years after what happens in the Northern Hemisphere. So that kicked off his career. And basically, Billy Thorpe was the prototype pub rock sound. It was loud, it was in your face, it was aggressive. Billy Thorpe's catch cry to the audience was "suck more piss," because it sounds a bit rough, but piss being beer and all that sort of thing. So when people actually paid to go to the pub, they would pay equivalent to $1 or $2, very low cover charge. All the revenue that would go to the bands would be out of the drink takings. So you need bands that were in your face, that were loud, because most of the punters were drunk and you'd really have to win them over. And you had a lot of those early bands like Billy Thorpe, AC/DC, Skyhook's Angels that honed their craft to win over the audience. Now, I've said it on, I think it was on Sea of Tranquility, a similar show. I related it to that scene in the Blues Brothers where the Blues Brothers go to that Texan hick cowboy and they really have to just, win over the audience and they're throwing beer bottles. It was like that in the scene. They had sawdust on the pub floor because, people vomiting and they had to clean up after. It was pretty rough in the 70s. So it was no holds barred, but you had to have bands that were very in your face, very out there to win the audience. And it was a style of music that was blues, hard rock, progressive, and very loud. I've heard stories that a lot of people have got permanent hearing damage to this day from Billy Thorpe in the 70s in those pubs. It was that loud. So I think it's more of this was the venues. It was the type of venues that was a source of actually accessing music more than an actual defined music, because it's like an octopus. It's in tentacles in all different directions. And you look at Wikipedia, anytime I'm doing research for a song and just for a band, and I'm doing it on my channel, and it always, if it's Australian, they always put the category pub rock. It seems to be a bit loose. It's a little bit like hair metal, it's just one of these characteristics. But pubs were the venues that we, in the day, in the 70s and 80s, could see bands. And they were the days that you could see a band in every suburb every day of the week. It was just a fertile ground. Sadly, today, things have changed. I mean, you'd be lucky to see a couple of pubs on the weekend with bands. Things have changed completely because, generations have moved on. But in the 70s and 80s, that was the social scene for the youth. And that's where the music was a fertile ground. So I'll quote some bands. You had Billy Thorpe. You had Daddy Cool being Ross Wilson. He was picking up a lot of that rockabilly from, the 50s, had a hit with Eagle Rock that I think may have been known in the Northern Hemisphere. Of course, you had the AC/DC. Now, Vander and Young are very big in this whole thing. All of the Vander and Young stable on the Albert label, you could virtually say are pub rock. You had, AC/DC, Stevie Wright, who solo from the Easy Beats, Ted Mulry Gang. Anything on that connection with Vander and Young were very much in pub rock. And then you had bands like in the late 70s, Cold Chisel, early 80s, Divinals, New Wave, Radio Birdman, as I've said, which were indie, and also Australia Crawl, which were a little bit more surf rock. So I'm just throwing a couple of names if people want to check them out, just to get an idea of what's classified as pub rock. But it's a broad church. You cannot really pin it to any particular genre other than it's electrified. And this is where we saw bands, because there were pubs everywhere and there was music playing 7 days a week, which I miss those days. You just don't get that anymore. But there are bands playing everywhere, and it was just a fertile ground for music and rock. So that's pub rock. It's just a broad term, but if you want to pin it to a particular genre and what it sounds like, it's anything that plugs into an amplifier. And maybe if you really want to be precise, it's got a little bit of blues, hard edge, bit of rock.
Wow. So it sounds like pub rock, because if you look at Wikipedia, pub rock died when punk came on the scene. But it sounds like, by listening to you gentlemen, that pub rock just basically kept going. It just kind of morphed. It's not like it was really ever killed, because Peter, you're talking that there are acts that went into the 80s that you would consider pub rock.
Correct.
Well, there you go.
Absolutely.
See Wikipedia, kids. You can't trust it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the difference would be, though, there's not, certainly in UK pub rock, there's not many new acts that we would identify as part of that movement. Again, movement rather than sound. And those guys that we think of as pub rock had moved on to something else by then. Mm-hmm. So, I didn't even mention Dr. Feelgood, for example. Mm-hmm. So they would be much more identified by then as a punk band, even though distinctly, for some people, 101 pub rock, with Wilco Johnson, Lee Berlow, and whatnot, very inspired by Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, Mick Green's guitar sounds, rather than Clapton and Beck and Page and things. So very, very different scene in the 80s, where I don't think anybody coming up wouldn't be called pub rock through the 80s. I think they would have to have had their start in the 70s, really. I think that's
gotcha.
Pretty much the cutoff.
Yeah. And in the 80s in Australia, you had a lot of bands that wouldn't be considered in any shape or form as pub rock, but they played the pubs, like bands like Icehouse, or earlier known as Flowers. You had bands like Pseudo Echo, Kids in the Kitchen. I'm talking about more synth pop. So it was sort of changing the sound from pure rock into pop acts that were just playing the pubs. And because simply that's where people went to see their music.
Well, how would you look at Hoodoo Gurus, Peter? I'm just curious.
I've always thought them as garage rock, but again, if you look at Wikipedia, which I'm not looking at,
well,
I'm sure
not either.
there's
I'm
sure it says pub rock, because they did their bread and butter in the pub circuit.
Right. All right.
And just like the selection of beer that you can get at your average pub, 95% of them would be absolutely atrocious. But the cream rises. So.
There you go. All right, Martin, let's throw it over to you. Thank you,
well,
Peter,
okay, I'll comment first on the Australian situation and the Australian definition, because I think the music is a little broader in Australia versus what you call pub rock out of the UK. Get to that in a minute, but and I also feel strongly that you want to link it to a time, and I really feel like linking it to the mid 70s is a good way to do this. So I would add in Buffalo and Lobby Lloyd and Colored Balls and that trajectory up to Rose Tattoo. Right. I'd put that in there. Black Feather at the Mountains of Madness is part of this as well. But yeah, and I think it's interesting how the Angels basically sounded quite pub rock on their first album, and that's it. And AC/DC sounded quite pub rock on their first album, and that's it. So I think there's a little bit of that going with it as well. You've got the Dingoes in there as well, which is a nice link to the weird odd asterisks of this pub rock thing, where there's a country and western sort of vibe to the early stuff. When you get over to Bees Make Honey and Eggs Over Easy and that whole weird, and early Brinsley Schwartz, that whole early version that seems to be almost as influenced by Troubadour, Avocado Mafia, country rock from America or something, right? So it's kind of weird. So the Dingoes kind of go in there as well. So yeah, did I say Buffalo? I mean, Buffalo, I feel, I feel, they famously, the one band in Australia signed to Vertigo Records, maybe a little heavy. But I remember researching, I didn't look it up again, but I remember I was fascinated looking at all these videos of like the Melbourne Sharps, right? The Sharpies, yeah. Unbelievable, like a weird sort of crazy skinhead looking, and the girls look creepy too, like a little bit like skinhead creepy girls. And they had the weird dance going on that you could see Bon Scott doing from time to time in early AC/DC. So some of that music kind of fits in there as well. So I want to tie it to the mid 70s. But now moving back to the UK. So yeah, you have this strange this strange version that happens in the early 70s. But then what it almost becomes is I think it becomes a little more focused. I'm going a little tighter in on the stylistic range than Davy did, but I really feel that there's a lot of it. I hate pub rock. Man, I can't stand it. This is a kind of music that I really don't like. And to me, what it is it's almost like how there was rocker culture in the 50s and 60s kind of thing, and it kind of goes away. And Davey, like you mentioned that festival is almost like their Quadrophenia movie in a way. But rocker culture doesn't come back in a big way, but it comes back and it smells funny. It comes back as part of glam, as part of UK glam, and it comes back so this rock and roll revival idea, right? It comes back as glam, and it comes back double as hard with what I call the actual pub rock sound, which is, if you want to pick something square, it's Dr. Feelgood, Wilco Johnson, Eddie and the Hot Rods. As much as I wanted to love that band and like that band, and I bought those records and new releases because they look so cool and they had a punk name, I did not like them. And I still try periodically every few years. Oh, this is the year I'm going to get into Eddie and the Hot Rods. Never happens, right? So I'll give you a couple of props. So again, what almost speaks to my dislike of pub rock is the metaphor of Ducks Deluxe moving into the Motors. Love the Motors, do not like this stuff at all. It's and again, I think what you're feeling here is the idea of a hangover from that whole rock and roll revival thing that you get in the campier glam bands, that Irish show band feel and look, the wearing of the costumes and all that kind of stuff, right? The pantsuits. So it's a type of music that you can hear on here. Kilburn and the High Roads, as much as I want to like that pre-Ian Dury band, don't like it. It again is this rock and roll revival sound. It's almost like it's not as purely rocker as the American version of rocker, i.e. Sha Na Na, but it's down that road. It's revival music, right? Of that old rock and roll thing. And people always have to constantly remind me, look, rock and roll wasn't that long ago when these revivals all are sort of happening, right? You've got Chili Willy and the Red Hot Peppers, same kind of thing, just this watered down, really dated, cheesy sort of glam hangover rock and roll revival thing. Cursor Flyers, same kind of thing. I do not like it. I don't like any of these bands. I try them out every once in a while, don't like them. Count Bishops is a funny one. It's kind of like this lonely rock and roll revival band that you may as well throw into pub rock. Graham Parker's a funny one, because what I would say is that with Graham Parker, you really only have these first two albums that you want to throw in there, because I worship this guy to death. He's one of my favorite guys in the whole world. An Up Escalator, masterpiece. Another Gray Area, The Real Macaw, masterpiece. Squeezing Out Sparks, masterpiece. I don't like these early ones very much. They're too pub rock for me, right? But I do have the Graham Parker and the Rumors Stick to Me stickers. That's kind of cool. 2 sets of them. Kind of neat, eh? I took out my Stiff Records box set. So the only shining light to me is I do love early Nick Lowe. I mean, not early Nick Lowe, mid-years Nick Lowe. Mm-hmm. And I do love Dave Edmunds as time goes on, and I like Rockpile. So I like this this version of this sort of Stiff Records camp where you've got your Reckless Eric, and I'll just take out my CDs here. So this is a 4 CD box set. It's got a lot of stuff on here I barely remember at all. Like, so many bands went nowhere on Stiff. You can understand how they didn't make much money, right?
Yeah, a lot of them were single acts.
Dr. Feelgood is here. Nick Lowe is here. Elvis Costello. Yeah, Elvis Costello is a funny one, right? He's the interesting thing that moves over to new wave from pub rock, not post-punk, but new wave, right? He's almost like an American new wave artist, right? There you go. And yeah, you got some Ian Dury here and some Jonah Louie and Rachel Sweet and yeah, the Rumors here. Yeah, the Rumor. Oh, the Rumor has albums on their own without Graham Parker. I just love at least one of them. That first album is amazing. Just love it to death. But yeah, so yeah, Rugulator. Yeah, another one. Can't stand these guys. Really don't like this sound. And another reason I really have it in for this sound is that I want to dispel the rumor, because I've been kind of working on and off. I don't know if it'll ever come out, but you know how I did that Who Invented Heavy Metal book, right? So I've got this Who Invented Punk book project I've been working on for years, right? And there's a whole fascinating US story and a whole fascinating UK story, right? And one of the parts of that whole story that people bring up, I think lazily, is this idea that pub rock had anything to do with punk rock. And I almost want to like break that because I really don't believe it. I love Davy when you said status quo roadies. That is such a great description of this. But yeah, I mean, it is in the pubs, and punks in the pubs, and new wave of British heavy metals in the pubs and all that. And it was a pub thing, and it was more of a London pub thing. And I watched a cool video of this old guy who was part of the scene. He was a promoter, and he goes through all the pubs that were involved in this. It's pretty interesting, right? But yeah, I just really dislike this music. I really hate this rock and roll revival thing. I hated when glam bands did it, and I don't like any of the rocker bands, and that whole rocker thing is so weird. I love the dress, love the fashion, crazy fashion, that whole rocker look. But this is not rocker look. This is as Davey, as like you say, it's denim and shirts and you think of Wilco and the suit and all that stuff, and so it's I really don't think it bears much relationship to punk at all. I love when you said, Davey, like you broke it down, how saying it doesn't have the anger, and it doesn't. It's more of a happy rock and roll, good time sort of thing. But yeah, old time rock and roll, I just do not like it in any form. I mean, give me status quo, give me them rocking out on a super heavy, high octane boogie. That's as close as I'm gonna get to liking this rock and roll thing. So if you duct tape me to a chair and said, you got to listen to 50 pub rock albums from the UK or Australia, I'll take Australia any day, because I really do feel Australia is just a bigger variety of music. That Heavy Metal Kid album, right? That Colored Balls thing from 74. And I love that stuff, right? And it's just that, yeah, Buster Brown, right? I think that's another one from that whole thing, right? And I love watching those videos of the Melbourne Sharpie thing. That thing is hilarious, right? So that's really cool. But yeah, so that's my treatise. I mean, it's fascinating hearing you guys talk about this. And I just love it as a cultural movement, but I cannot stand this music.
It's interesting that you say the connection with punk, and people do say quite often that they're very similar scenes, but really that just goes to show how much of a Venn diagram the whole music scene was at that point. In the UK especially, you had to be based in London at that point, so everybody was basically playing the same circuits. You would get, the famous gig in 72, I want to say, the Greasy Truckers Party. The lineup is Man, Hawkwind, Motorhead, no, not Motorhead, because Lemmy was still on Hawkwind, but Hawkwind and Brinsley Schwartz. So you're getting these long jam bands, space rock, and then you're getting country boogie. So people were less interested in labels and definition, and more interested in just let's go and have a
Davey,
time with it.
You reminded me of something. If I could draw a parallel, you know how I always argue, and I always get a lot of complaints about this, but I always argue that heavy metal is invented when the blues is like, mercilessly excised from it, right? The British blues boom is taken out of it. There's no blues in Black Sabbath. I keep saying that, even though Tony Iommi thinks there is. There's a little bit on Warning, which they didn't write, and there's some bluesy soloing, and they got Rock and Roll Doctor, a boogie song later on, but there's no blues in Black Sabbath, and that's the point, right? The song Black Sabbath has no blues in it, so you're getting rid of the British blues boom. The parallel is, I think punk becomes invented when you take the old goofy rock and roll out of it, and that's why I don't want to link the two.
And I think
I don't quite agree with that, Martin. Like Motorhead, there's a lot of blues all the way through there.
I'll fight you that one to the death too. I don't think there's much blues in Motorhead either. Lemmy says we're a rock and roll band. They're such a heavy metal band, though. They really are a super heavy metal band. We just had this argument on Facebook, right?
There's a lot of blues licks in Motorhead.
I don't know.
Clean your ears out, mate.
Yeah. I mean, they've got some boogie songs. They got a few blues songs. And, when people have this argument and when they want to have the argument intelligently, and I can buy into it, the doorway into that is when you think of bluesy licks and bluesy solos, right? And that's where I'll buy it a little bit with Fast Eddie, and I'll buy it with Tony Iommi. And the building blocks are all from that, right? But basically, Motorhead, 85% of the time, is a flat out heavy metal band, right? They're not a rock and roll band. They're not a blues band. Same thing with Sabbath. I mean, they're just killing it with massive heavy metal riffs almost all the time.
Got another show idea, Grant? Come on.
Yeah.
There you go. We're always looking for ideas.
I love fighting that one. I love fighting this whole.
And then there's still crossover. I mean, you'll get Wilco Johnson working with Motorhead and things, and working with various members. So there's always crossover. But again, it tends to be crossover because they know each other from, again, the scene, not because they're saying our music is identical. It tends to just be we've been label mates, or we used to be in bands together, because the musical DNA again is so similar for everybody. I mean, that for Tony Iommi and guys like that to just shut the blues off completely, the flick of the decade into 1970 wouldn't be entirely possible. So when they're jamming, sure, that will still come out because that's what.
Well, by late 1970, sure did, because I don't hear
on
5
record,
seconds of blues on Paranoid.
I totally agree with Peter that on stage, certainly, like if you let them go for more than a couple of minutes,
tell me about the blues on the Paranoid album.
Was just said on stage though.
Yeah, I know, but my point is, like, their canon of songs moving forward. I mean, there's no blues on Master Reality. There's sluggish playing and a jamminess on some of the Volume 4 songs. There's no blues whatsoever on Sabotage, none on Sabbath Bloody Sabbath. I mean, this is a band that just
anybody would say they're a blues band, but certainly you can definitely hear in their live stuff, these guys have played blues. There's just licks that are pure blues. Freddie King licks all over the place.
And even Ozzy's vocals scatting is a little bit bluesy. So Ozzy's a very unorthodox singer, and when he does his vocal lines, that all comes from the blues.
I don't know. This is the other thing. This is going to be a great show because I don't like this. To me, the parallel, when you start getting abstract like that, I consider it a version of getting abstract. The same way when people say punk rock, oh, there were mosh pits in front of the theater shows in France and England in the 1700s, and that was punk rock, or just being defiant and different is punk rock, and that to me starting to call Ozzy's vocals bluesy. I mean, it's just not the blues.
Well, the difference is Ozzy did grow up listening to that, and so did the band, though, and going to those gigs.
I don't care. I mean, we're talking about Black Sabbath because they got rid of it.
He wasn't going to see Brahms. He wasn't going to see Beethoven.
We're talking about Black Sabbath today because they excise the blues from their sound. That's what I'm saying.
I would have to say, I'm going to interject. I have to say Ozzy is one of the least soulful vocalists I've ever heard in my whole life.
Yeah.
And if you're doing the blues, you need to have some soul.
Not necessarily.
I think
I'm
so.
talking about blues melodies. And,
Yeah,
an Aussie in his own way. There's a little bit of his own soul to this.
I don't
Anyway,
think so.
this is the Contrarians.
However, I would
This
say,
might be one of the best Contrarian episodes ever.
well,
I'm
what's the
gonna
point
go
of
on
contrarian-
record
What's
to
the
say
point
that.
of contrarianism if you agree all the time?
Yeah.
But to argue against it, to go back on it, I can absolutely see that in the construction and the writing and the recording, nobody once said, hey, let's do something a bit John Mayall. Nobody ever said that recording a Motorhead record or a Sabbath record, not at all.
Yeah.
On stage, sure, they're just thinking, what can we do right now? In the moment, your musical past just filters through you. It's been part of you. You can't change who you are. But on records, absolutely, there's a clear intent to put away childish things and become whatever the hell this is. Starting with Black Sabbath.
And what I love, the apocryphal moment, and Jim Simpson told me this directly, and I loved when he was talking about this, right? He's booking all these British blues booms bands into his bar, and he just decided eventually, like, this is such boring music. There's so many rules. I'm just getting fed up listening to these bluesy bands. And then all of a sudden, kind of at the same time, Black Sabbath writes Black Sabbath, and they come up with this concept of the horror thing, and it's almost like Jim's a little bit involved in that. But basically, it almost seemed like it was just time to put that thing aside because it just had too many rules. Everybody sounded the same, and it was really boring.
Yeah, and very rigid. Like every scene burns itself out, and especially a scene that's so derivative, but it just burned itself out that much faster. I mean, Jethro Tull, by the time they put out their first record, already have to change their sound for the second one. Like, there's no room. There's no room for that anymore. So we're kind of on a tangent, but a tangent that's related because we're talking about two musical styles that are often conflated, that aren't always, when you look into it, terribly mixed. So to go back to pub rock, take Joe Strummer, for example, obviously punk icon. And people will say the Clash started out as a pub band. No, they don't. Joe Strummer had a pub rock band. The 101s, I think they were called.
Yeah, 101ers, maybe.
And listen to them, and you can hear the Bo Diddley influence. You can hear the chess blues influence, Howlin' Wolf all over the place. Now, you will get some of that with the Clash, obviously. You'll get things like Brand New Cadillac and whatnot, but it's a very different version of that. They're not just playing a blues song or an old rock and roll song. When they cover something like Stagger Lee and turn it into something else entirely, it's a different beast. They're not just doing another version of the old chestnut.
Well, Davey, we also forgot to mention, I mean, in a very succinct way, I mean, people essentially can define pub rock as punky blues. It's just sped up blues, right? It's boogie rock. It's a little status quo. You know what it reminds me of a little bit? It's almost like the poppy status quo of the early 80s moving forward all the way through. If you took that stuff and gave it like watered down and worse writing because they're not as smart yet, if you took their 80s and 90s and 2000s or whatever albums and stuck them in 1974 instead of the awesome stuff we actually got from Quo, and gave it a bad recording and made the songs worse, you'd pretty much get pub rock.
It's a great example because status quo are what people think pub rock should be like, just looks and attitudes and that kind of boogie vibe. But status quo, 1976? So what was their album then? Quo, just Quo, wouldn't it be?
Yeah,
about
Quo. They had they started with Pile Driver, so Hello, On the Level, Quo,
I'm thinking
Blue
Quo
for You,
almost
Quo,
exactly
slash,
exactly
rock and
here
roll.
I'm thinking. And Quo is a masterpiece of like hard, heavy rock. And nothing to do with pub rock whatsoever in any of its permutations. And most importantly, Quo weren't playing pubs, so they weren't catering to that audience. Essentially, very like Peter said, it's whatever made the audiences happy. So you had to, if you had a local scene that was going, and you had a DJ, usually John Peel, who was sympathetic to your sound and would give you some airplay. You could get on that gravy train and keep going for a good few years. You didn't need to sell massive amounts of records and tour terribly much. That was another great thing. Although they weren't getting paid big because they were playing pubs, and when people hear pubs, they probably think two men and a dog playing dominoes, but not that the dog played dominoes, but bigger venues as well still can be pub rock. Not much bigger, but certainly slightly bigger. Venues that have like a place in the back that opens up. And so acts sometimes get conflated into pub rock that are nothing to do with it. I mean, you'll even see David Coverdale referred to as pub rock in places because the early Whitesnake stuff's more like boogie and stuff, and you think no, you can't just conflate not everything works in a scene. Just because somebody plays 3 chords fast doesn't make them punk. Just because somebody has a bit of rebelliousness, like you were saying, in the 17th century, doesn't make them punk, as we're referring to that movement and that aesthetic and that scene. So sometimes there's echoes, sometimes there's just commonality of influences, but in general, though it is a very amorphous scene, there is quite a rigid structure broadly towards the edges. You can say, you might not be able to always say what something is, but you can say what it isn't, put it that way.
Yeah. Peter, any closing thoughts?
Well, I think I can only sort of detail from the Australian experience. It was a very broad church. I was just recalling like bands like Air Supply got their initial gigs in the pub scene. One of my favorite stories is Air Supply supported Rose Tattoo and survived.
Oh, no.
And at the end of the show, Rose Tattoo thanked Air Supply for their, persistence in making it through. But everybody played the pub scene, soft rock, Little River Band. It was a big, broad church. I don't think you can just pin it to a particular sound. And I think it's a little bit slightly different to UK than what Davy has explained it.
Well put. Yeah.
Fertile ground for music. And I miss those
Grant,
times.
what do you think? Are you a pub rock fan now?
I don't know. I'm going to have to dip my toe in them. I don't know yet.
And
I like Nick Lowe. I like the first Nick Lowe solo stuff. I have never heard anything prior to that, so I don't know. I'm a newbie, kids.
Much more countryish, but certainly Nick Lowe is not very prolific in that early period. He does those first 2 classics and then kind of takes a step back almost straight away because he formed Rockpile with Dave Edmunds, as was mentioned, and
Rockpile, yeah.
What a band. And the scene was massive in Germany as well. Almost all of these bands you can find have got a concert film from Rock Palace. So the scene was big in Germany. And interesting that there's not really a US equivalent terribly much for a lot of this kind of stuff. Because
Southside Johnny and the Asbury Dudes,
Johnny would be
early Bruce Springsteen.
But then the problem with Southside Johnny is, how the hell would an actual pub band, as in we're not playing for very much, afford a horn section like the Asbury Jukes? They wouldn't. So they had to have bigger patron the amounts of people coming through the doors. And Southside relied on a lot of handoffs from Springsteen in those early days, certainly.
But you're right. I mean, I can't think of a scene that makes a whole bunch of music that sounds like what we just, or I just, accused UK pub rock music to be there. Yeah, there wasn't really a pub rock scene, I don't think. No.
All right, I guess we've tackled it.
We've got our Motorhead Blues and Sabbath Blues shows planned.
No,
all right.
I'm looking forward to that.
For those kids, those are on the way.
The next one's going to be Mozart versus Sabbath, and then they're going to have a showtime. So.
Yeah,
I like it.
That would be fun. So,
all right, kids. Well, there's your pub rock info hour. That's where I'm going to put it. I don't know. I don't have anything more to add. I want to thank Davy and Peter Kerr, and of course Martin's here. I'm actually speechless on this. But if you'd like to be part of these discussions, we do have a Patreon account, which you can join. You could be part of these discussions. We're at a Ko-fi, buy us a pint or a cup of coffee. We like that.
And coffee, a pint, pub.
Right.
Yeah, a beer.
Yeah.
A beer. A
pint.
Yeah.
And then we also have the T Public down below with merch. So we've got it all here. And now you have your definitive pub rock discussion. So I want to thank everybody. Please leave a comment. We want to hear from you. What do you think of pub rock? Give us your favorite bands. Are you new to this? We want to hear. So, all right, gentlemen, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun. And we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you later.